In terms naman po sa creativeness, merong greater capacity for original thinking yung mga estudyante na nag-score ng mataas sa SSS scale, pero hindi nila yun ine-express dun sa mga schoolwork nilang pinapasa. They are also attracted to speculative, bizarre, and even pseudoscientific ideas and continually search for novel experiences. If they cannot find them in external situations, they may look inward and create a fantasy world. Next is occupational preferences. They tend to choose different jobs than low sensation seekers. Correlated po siya positively sa scientific interest and negative naman sa mga clerical interest. Interest in the helping professions such as psychologist, physician, psychiatrist, social worker, and minister. Nagko-correlate naman siya negatively sa business sector jobs tulad ng mga accountant, purchasing agent, and banker. Kapag mga teachers, meron tayong low sensation seeker. Unlike sa mga lawyers na meron silang high sensation seeker. Sila ay mga high sensation seeker. High sensation seekers of both sexes who were interested in the helping professions expressed a preference for risky, cutting-edge jobs such as crisis intervention or paramedic duty on emergency response teams. Attitudes. High sensation seekers, they tend to be more liberal than in their political and religious attitudes than low sensation seekers, and they express more permissive attitudes toward sexual behavior, whether their own or that of other people. Ngayon, kapag low sensation seekers naman, pwedeng pumasok dito yung mga madalas pumunta sa simbahan at meron silang low tolerance for ambiguity. Heredity versus environment. A large amount of research consistently shows a strong hereditary basis for the sensation-seeking personality factor. 58% of this trait could be accounted for the genetic factors. Yung mga low sensation-seeking parents daw natin, sila yung mga fearful, protective, and inhibiting of their children, forbidding them to engage in adventurous behaviors. Dito kasi, nare-restrict yung mga bata pa lang, nare-restrict na sila. So, yung upbringing nila, sila yung mga bata na hindi sila nag-e-engage yung mga adventurous behaviors. Unlike dun sa mga bata na ang upbringing nila, yung mga parents nila ay mga high sensation seekers. Yung mga high sensation seeking parents kasi, mas ine-encourage nila at nire-reinforce nila yung mga anak nila to do and to engage themselves in unusual activities or providing an environment that promotes additional sensation-seeking behaviors. Ongoing research suggests that other environmental factors in childhood and adolescence may affect the level of sensation-seeking. Highlights of the research of Zuckerman's ideas. People who score high in sensation-seeking tend to score high in adventure-seeking, disinhibition, and susceptibility to boredom. And usually, they live in westernized countries or westernized cultures. Takes risks, do drugs and alcohol, drive fast, and engage in frequent sex. Spend a lot of time playing computer games. Be extroverted, open to new experiences. Conscientious and emotional. Be interested in the helping professions such as psychologist or social worker rather than in business. Have liberal political and religious views. Be the only child or the firstborn child in their family and have more body piercings and tattoos. Martin E. P. Seligman learned helplessness and the optimistic or pessimistic explanatory style. In the mid-1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman, 1942, at the University of Pennsylvania, who would later lead the happiness and positive psychology trend in psychology, began research on a limited domain facet of personality called learned helplessness. Yung learned helplessness, ito yung condition na nagre-result dun sa iniisip natin na wala tayong control over dun sa environment natin or sa mga external factors natin. Para mapag-aralan niyang mabuti yung concept ng learned helplessness, ginamit niya yung experiment sa mga aso. He first saw this phenomenon in an experiment on dogs on his first day as graduate student. It marked the beginning of the direction of his future in psychology and the future of psychology itself. Yung mga aso, kinondition sila na ma-associate sa high-pitch sound na may electric shock. Ito ay example ng Pavlovian classical conditioning situation na involved dun sa respondent behavior. Yun yung una niyang study. Ngayon, makikita natin dito sa table, yung mga dogs dun sa experimental group, in-expose sila sa electric shock. Then yung mga dogs dun sa control group, hindi sila in-expose dun sa first electric shocks. Then, after 30 seconds, yung mga dogs dun sa experimental group, bumagsak na lang sila sa sahig at nag-give up sila. Ngayon, yung mga dogs naman dun sa control group, accidentally, may mga dalawang box kasi yun, yung ginawa nila. Ngayon, dun sa gitna ng box, may barrier dun. Ngayon, ang ginawa nila dun, open lang yun, yung barrier. Ngayon, yung mga dogs dun sa control group, accidentally, natalon nila yung barrier at nakapunta sila dun sa safe compartment kung saan walang electric shocks. Then, yung mga dogs dun sa experimental group, hindi nila natutunan kung paano tumalon dun sa kabila ng barrier or tumalon over dun sa barrier para makapunta sila dun sa safe compartment. Not even when experimenters tried to entice them over the barrier with food. On succeeding, doon naman sa dogs po sa control group, on succeeding trials, learned the escape way. Doon sa mga dogs sa experimental group, doon naman sa part ng mga dogs sa experimental group, they become passive and helpless and would make no attempt to change their situation. Kahit pa binibigyan na sila or kahit pa may food na naka-offer sa kanila once na nalampasan nila yung barrier. Kahit na mababa lang yung barrier na nilagay nila dun sa 2 compartments nung box, yung mga dogs dun sa experimental group, nag-give up na sila compared dun sa mga dogs sa control group na nung nalaman nila na pagpala sila tumalon dun sa barrier at nakapunta dun sa safe place, hindi na sila makokuryente. Next naman is in-apply din nila yung learned helplessness dun sa mga tao. Ngayon, yung sa experimental group, in-expose sila sa isang loud, irritating noise at sinabi sa kanila na hindi nila yun mapapatay yung sound na yun unless they press a series of buttons in a correct sequence. Doon naman sa control group, ang ginawa nila, yung noise, pwede nilang mapatigil by pressing the buttons in a sequence that was relatively easy to learn. So, yung experimental group, kinondition sila na para mawala yung irritating noise, kailangan malaman muna nila yung series ng pagpindot sa button in a correct sequence. Pero dun sa control group, sila naman, sinabi sa kanila na pwede nilang i-turn off yung noise kapag pinress lang nila yung button dun sa the same sequence, pero mas madali compared dun sa gagawin ng experimental group. Ngayon, yung experimental group, kinondisyon sila yung mga buttons doon na pipindutin nila para mapatay nila yung irritating na noise or sound, wala talagang correct sequence. Kaya kahit anong gawin ng mga subjects na nandun sa experimental group, yung noise patuloy pa rin doon sa pag-ingay, or nandun pa rin yung irritating sound na naririnig nila. So next step naman ang ginawa sa kanila, yung sa experimental group, para mapatigil yung noise, kailangan i-move nila yung hand nila from one side ng box to other side in response to a light signal. Yung experimental group, hindi na sila nag-effort para mapatigil yung irritating noise. Unlike dun sa control group, mas madali nilang natutunan yung behavior na tinuturo sa kanila na i-move nila yung hand nila from one side of the box to other in response to a light signal para mapatigil nila yung sound. Learned helplessness was found to occur after human subjects simply observed helpless models, especially when the subjects recognized similarities between themselves and the models. If the models can't do anything about this, then neither can I. Ito yung parang nagiging mindset na nila kasi nga nahirapan sila or iniisip nila na kung hindi kayang gawin ng model, hindi rin nila kayang gawin sa sarili nila, or hindi rin nila kayang i-overcome. Effects of inescapable shock were even stronger in human than in animal subjects. Ngayon, yung learned helplessness, ginamit iyon ng CIA na pang-torture dun sa mga prisoners nila. Yung mga prisoners nila, nilagay nila dun sa isang situation na hindi makakatakas sa mga painful stimuli na ginagawa nila. Halimbawa, yung isa, nilagay nila sa isang kabaong sa loob ng ilang araw. Then yung isa naman, nilunod nila ng 83 times sa loob ng 17 days. Yung iba, hinubaran and iniwan lang nila dun sa isang solitary confinement for days habang may naririnig siya na nakakabingi na mga music or mga irritating noise. Then after nilang ma-expose dun sa mga ganun, sa mga painful na mga stimuli and conditions, yung mga prisoners nag-exhibit sila ng same symptoms ng learned helplessness nung nandun na sila sa laboratory experiments. Naging compliant na sila at hindi na sila, dahil nga na-condition sila na hindi sila makakatakas doon sa facility na yun. Kaya nung nilagay sila doon sa laboratory experiment, inisip nila na hindi na sila nag-try na tumakas pa or to do anything about their conditions at naging compliant na lang sila. Okay, learned helplessness and emotional health. Among cancer patients ages 29 to 80, those with the highest perception of control were better adjusted than patients who believed they had little control over their situation. Dito, kapag mas mataas yung learned helplessness mo, sinasabi lang dito na mas mababa yung emotional health mo compared dun sa mga tao na may high perception of control. Animal research on learned helplessness and physical health. Rats were injected with malignant tumor cells. They were exposed to one of three conditions: an electric shock from which they could escape, a shock from which they could not escape, and no shock. Ito yung naging experiment. Dun sa experimental group, hindi nila kayang umalis or mag-escape dun sa shock. Then sa control group, no electric shock. After nilang ma-expose dun sa mga conditions na yun, dun sa experimental group, 27% lang ng mga daga yung nag-reject sa malignant cells at nag-survive. compare natin dun sa control group na dun sa 50% ang nag-reject ng tumor as expected. Then, after the study, nakita nila na 70% ng mga rats ang nag-reject ng tumor at nag-survive. Sinasabi nila na childhood experiences prove to be crucial in tumor rejection by adults. Childhood mastery, immunized, and early helplessness put adult rats at risk for cancer. These results were supported in a similar study of young rats. Ito nga yung sinasabi na yung mga rats nung na-reach nila yung adulthood, ininjikan sila ng mga malignant cells at in-expose ulit sila dun sa 3 experimental conditions na sinabi natin kanina. Ito yung shock from which they could escape, a shock from which they could not escape, and no shock. Majority ng mga rats na natuto or inisip nila na or na condition sila na helpless sila na hindi nila kayang i-escape yung ganong situation, nag-failed sila nung adult na sila to reject the tumors. Pero majority naman ng mga rats na natuto na magkaroon sila ng control nung bata pa sila, ni-reject nila yung tumor nung adult na sila. At yung findings nila dun, learned helplessness was shown to weaken the immune systems of rats. Physiological explanation why rats were unable to reject their tumors. Kasi daw, yung immune system natin, nagpo-form siya ng major part. Yung immune system natin, yun yung defense natin against sa illness. Ngayon, yung immune system natin, meron siyang several kinds of cells like the T cells and the NK cells or the natural killer cells. And yung mga cells na yun, yung mga tumutulong para ma-resist or malabanan natin yung mga viruses, bacteria, and tumor cells. Yung mga rats na subjected dun sa shock, dun sa inescapable shock, hindi na sila nag-multiply or mabagal na yung pag-multiply ng mga T cells nila in response dun sa specific invaders nila. And yung NK cells nila or yung natural killer cells nila, na nawala na yung ability to destroy other infections. Later research with rats, most male rats exposed to uncontrollable stress never learn how to escape, whereas most female rats do learn to escape. Learned helplessness was easier to establish in males than in females. Females are less subject to the kind of dangerous physiological changes found in the earlier study. Explanatory style, optimism and pessimism. Pag sinabi po nating optimism, ibig sabihin ito yung positive thinking. Then yung pessimism naman is the negative thinking. Yung explanatory style, it is a way of explaining to ourselves our relative lack of control over our environment. Pag sinabing optimistic explanatory style, pinaprevent nito yung helplessness. Optimists build better social network and connection and are also better able to cope with physical pain. Unlike dun sa mga pessimistic explanatory style, mas prone sila sa learned helplessness in all facets of life. In terms of physical health naman, mas maganda yung health ng mga optimistic explanatory style type of people kumpara dun sa mga pessimist explanatory style. Halimbawa, yung mga optimistic explanatory style, mas responsible sila na alagaan yung kanilang sarili, yung kanilang health, and if ever na magkasakit sila, they are more likely to cope better with health problems or recover faster from certain medical procedures. Mas namamanage din nila yung stress nila. At based dun sa study, dun sa breast cancer, kapag isa kang optimistic explanatory style, mas mahaba ng 5 years yung buhay mo compared dun sa mga explanatory style. Kapag naman ikaw ay isang pessimist explanatory style, yung physical health mo, more likely, meron kang negative beliefs about sa buhay, and mas risk ka na magkaroon ng higher blood pressure readings. And you are unlikely to try to prevent illness by changing your behavior. And twice as many infectious illnesses over a 1-year period. In terms naman po sa longevity, mas mahaba ang buhay ng mga optimistic explanatory style by about 19%. Sa age naman po, people over 65 tend to have a more optimistic life. Doon naman sa pessimistic explanatory style, they claim that they weighed more than they actually did. Yung mga elderly people, kapag ikaw ay isang optimistic explanatory style type of person, less yung depression mo compared dun sa younger people. In terms naman sa culture, yung mga optimistic, syempre, mga positive thinkers sila, so they are happier and less ang depression, less ang anxiety and hostility. And mas maganda yung sleep pattern nila compare doon sa mga pessimist explanatory style. Halimbawa ng culture is yung Americans and Japanese. Yung mga Americans, nag-fall under sila sa optimistic explanatory style. Based dun sa study, dun sa mga students nila, they are far more likely to predict that positive events would happen to them rather than to other people. Kapag mga Japanese naman, mas naniniwala sila na may magandang mangyayari dun sa ibang tao kaysa sa sarili nila. In terms of handling stress naman, mas magaling mag-handle ng stress yung mga optimistic explanatory style kaysa sa mga pessimist. At dahil nga hindi magaling mag-handle ng stress yung mga pessimist, mas mataas yung chance nila na magkaroon ng anxiety, stress, and physical health complaints. Okay, sa performance naman po, mas maganda yung grades or nagpe-perform ng mas maayos yung mga optimistic kaysa sa mga pessimist. Less anxious and more confident yung mga optimistic. Then sa cognitive function naman, yung mga optimistic attended to both positive and negative stimuli, flexible and adaptable. Yung sa mga pessimist naman, compare dun sa optimistic, yung optimistic kasi tinitingnan niya yung positive and negative stimuli. Kapag pessimist, mas nagpo-focus lang siya sa negative stimuli. Inflexible din sila, rigid, and likely to give up pursuing their goals. The downside of optimism. Kapag ikaw naman ay masyadong optimistic na tao, magkakaroon ka na ng unrealistic views tungkol sa vulnerability doon sa pag-uugali mo. Mas maka-experience ka ng greater disappointment after receiving your score. Like for example, sa exam, mas nagkakaroon ng greater disappointment sa part ng mga optimistic na tao at mas at nagkakaroon sila ng unrealistic optimism. Doon naman sa pessimist, nagkakaroon naman sila ng unrealistic pessimism. So in general, mas maganda talaga na maging isa kang optimistic type of person kaysa pessimist type of person. Kasi 'di ba nakita nga natin kanina na yung mga tao na high ang optimism, mas madali silang mag-cope sa stress, mas mahaba yung buhay nila, mas nakaka-recover sila kapag nagkaroon sila ng sakit or kapag namatayan sila ng family member or malapit na tao, mas nakaka-recover sila compare dun sa mga pessimist na tao. Nagkakaroon din sila ng mas mataas na grade at mas flexible sila and adaptable in their cognitive activities. Similarity of symptoms of learned helplessness and depression. Sa learned helplessness and depression, pareha silang passivity, difficult learning that responses produce relief. Dito naman sa depression, difficulty learning that responses produce outcomes. Lack of aggression sa depression naman, introjected hostility. Weight loss and anorexia, then sa depression ay loss of libido. Then sa learned helplessness, norepinephrine depletion. And in terms naman dun sa illness, ulcers and stress sa learned helplessness, and sa depression naman, ulcers and stress and feelings of helplessness. The development of learned helplessness in childhood. Although learned helplessness can occur throughout life, Seligman suggested that we are particularly vulnerable to developing those feelings in infancy and early childhood. During these formative years, the experience of learned helplessness can predispose us to the pessimistic explanatory style. Infants begin life in a state of total helplessness. Through early interactions with the physical and social environments, a child's sense of helplessness or of mastery and control will be determined. If the responses do not lead to success outcome, ang kakalabasan nun, learned helplessness. Then kapag consistent explanatory style naman ang na-develop by about age 8, naapektuhan yun ng parents' explanatory style. Yung mga explanatory style ng mga infant and nung ating early childhood, naapektuhan yun ng ating parents' explanatory style. Like for example, the greater the parents' formal education, the greater the optimism of their children. Learned helplessness may develop later in childhood in response to factors such as bullying from peers, a harsh school environment, or other negative experiences. Martin Seligman, Positive Psychology. So Martin Seligman is still alive, and his writing suggests that he is not particularly happy himself. Despite all his success and even celebrity status, he admitted that he is rarely happy, in the sense of feeling joyful. In 2010, he ranked himself among the lowest 30% of people in terms of positive feelings and emotions. He also said that a life can be perfectly good and perfectly satisfactory, he told a reporter, with no positive feeling. Nung 13 years old siya, yung tatay niya na-stroke at na-disable, at doon niya nalaman na-realize, nung 13 years old siya, na yung tatay niya na-stroke, na-disable, at dahil doon, naging helpless yung tatay niya. Nag-aral siya sa isang private prep school sa Albany, New York. Then accepted at Princeton and earned his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 1967. He is currently the director of the university's Positive Psychology Center. He is also a champion bridge player and has won a number of tournaments. Characteristics and causes of happiness. Psychologists have variously labeled the happy personality in terms such as subjective well-being or life satisfaction, and define it as encompassing a cognitive evaluation of the quality of one's life experience and the possession of positive moods and emotions. Ang happiness, meron siyang both rational and emotional aspects. Based dun sa research, may variety of factors daw na nakaka-influence sa ating happiness like money, physical attractiveness, health, age, adolescence, older people, marriage and social support, culture, geography, race and ethnicity, personality, self-efficacy, and internal locus of control and thinking positively. Ang highlight dun sa kanyang research about sa happiness, yung mga happy people or happier people, sila yung merong pera and live in a wealthy country. They think of themselves as more attractive and exercise more as they get older. Be married and without children. Dun kasi sa marriage and social support, lumalabas dun sa study na mas masaya yung mga tao na married unlike when compared dun sa mga single na tao. They also have a strong sense of ethnic identity, extroverted, conscientious, and high in self-efficacy and locus of control. Not be neurotic, enthusiastic, optimistic, and they are grateful. They have goals, a healthy lifestyle, and a high degree of social involvement. Have a proper balance between personal life and work. Spend time on the internet or maybe not. Happiness and success. Which comes first, happiness or success? Are some people happy because they are successful, or they are successful because they are happy? Research tends to show that happiness or subjective well-being leads to the kinds of behaviors that bring out success. People high in subjective well-being are more likely to secure job interviews, to be evaluated more positively by supervisors once they obtain a job, and show